So what do we mean by fixed and variable costs? Well, they're simply the costs associated with the fixed and variable inputs. So for fixed inputs, we've got a corresponding total fixed cost, and if we're talking about capital and space as examples of fixed inputs, then we would say the associated costs of them are going to be interest payments on loans for capital, or interest foregone if you've used your own money to purchase capital equipment, and rental payments. In the case of variable inputs, we've got a corresponding total variable cost, the cost of employing those variable inputs. And if we're talking about labour and raw materials as the variable inputs, then we have the corresponding wage payments and raw materials payments to be made. In the long run, of course, all of the inputs are variable, so the total cost of all of the inputs will be the same as the total variable cost, since all the costs are variable. And we've got the corresponding payments to be made for each of those inputs. Now let's look at the various measures of costs. So first let's look at total cost. Total cost is simply going to be the total fixed costs, the cost of the fixed inputs, the capital costs in simple terms, and the total variable costs. In simple terms, this is going to be the cost of labour plus raw materials. So just as a side note, how would you calculate the total fixed costs and total variable costs? Well, we're not going to go into this too much, but it's basically the sum of the prices of the fixed inputs times the quantity of the fixed inputs utilised, and the sum of the prices of the variable inputs multiplied by the quantity of the variable inputs employed. Anyway, back to our example. The total cost is going to be 1,500 plus 1,000. Total fixed cost plus total variable cost. In other words, 2,500. So that's pretty straightforward. What about average fixed cost? Well, when we talk about averages, we calculate averages in the same way we calculate any average. If, for example, you had, 3 bowling balls of different sizes, you could add up the weights of all of those bowling balls and then divide it by the number of bowling balls to get the average weight. And we'll do the same thing here with costs, except now we're talking about cost per unit of output. So we're dividing by the amount of output produced. So that's total fixed cost divided by output will give you the average fixed cost. In this example, it's 1,500 divided by 16 units of output. So the average fixed cost is 94. It's pretty straightforward. What about the average variable cost? Well, you can probably guess that it's going to be the total variable cost, the total labour and raw materials costs, divided by the output. So in this case, it's 1,000 divided by 16. So the average variable cost is 63. Now we want the average total cost. So we can calculate that as we've seen already. Total costs divided by the output gives you the average total cost. So that's 2,500 divided by 16, or 156. That is to say, each unit of output on average costs $156 to produce. We can calculate average total cost in a different way, however. We could just say average fixed cost plus average variable cost gives us the average total cost. That's pretty straightforward. We've already calculated the average fixed cost as 94 and the average variable cost is 63, so the average total cost is 157. Ooh, They're a bit off by these two different calculations, but that's just due to a rounding error. Now let's look at marginal cost. The marginal cost is going to be the cost of producing an additional unit of output. So increasing output from 16 to 17. So we're interested in the 17th unit of output. How much did that cost to produce? Not 17 units, the 17th unit. Well, we can calculate marginal cost by the change in the total cost divided by the change in output, where that change in output is 1 in this case. So it's the change in total cost is 3,000 minus 2,500 over the change in output, which is going from 16 to 17, so 1. So the cost of the 17th unit, the marginal cost of the 17th unit, is 500. We could calculate it another way by looking at the change in the total variable cost divided by the change in output. Why will this give us the same result? Because the only cause of any change in costs is going to be a change in the variable cost. The total fixed costs can't change. So if we calculate it this way, marginal cost equals 1,500 minus 1,000 divided by 1. Again, we get 500, the cost of the 17th unit of output.